All right, so typically I talk about the work that I've done. Instead, I'm going to talk about what influenced the work that I've done. And as Monty Python might say, now for something completely different. I want to start out with a quote by my favorite poet. Today happens to be the 127th birthday of Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa. And the quote goes like this, first in Portuguese, then in English. Tinha-me levantado cedo e tardava-me em preparar para me existir, which means I had woken up early and I took a long time getting ready to exist. I had woken up early and I had taken a long time getting ready to exist. And that sentiment seems to resonate in the room throughout this day as we've talked about love and this awakening within ourselves. My story starts in 1968. My dad was going to apply for or go to an interview for a graduate assistantship at the University of Nevada, Reno. He was driving his VW microbus. He had a 1-year-old son and his wife in tow, and he was desperate to get this assistantship because if he didn't, he wouldn't be able to pay for graduate school, and he'd have to go back to being a clerk at a bank. He gets to the University of Nevada, Reno, and he meets who would become his major professor, Alan Gardner. He sits with Alan and describes all of the amazing clinical psychologists that he was a fan of. And Alan, being a devout New Yorker, says, well, I'm very sorry, but I hate all of those people. You're clearly not a match for me. And but since you've driven all the way here from Los Angeles, I'd at least take you to the project that we're launching here. So they go down out of the building and walk across a long sidewalk, and you see off in the distance a little fenced playground. And as my dad and Alan are walking toward the playground, a little black creature that's playing in the playground spots the two of them and leaps over the fence, the chain link fence, and comes running toward the two of them and jumps not into Alan's arms, but into the arms of my father. And this was a young chimpanzee. And a young chimpanzee named Washoe. And Alan looks at my father, as the story goes, and says, well, you're hired. And the premise was that Washoe got to pick who worked with her. The premise was a premise of love. It was also a premise of play and fun. And so the couple items that I'm going to attempt to leave with you today of how this journey of being raised by a family of chimpanzee sign language researchers and their 5 chimpanzee siblings is what the story is about today. A little bit of background on the project. In the 1960s, John had talked a little bit about the protest movements and activist movements. Also in those activist movements were activism within the sciences. And the sciences were attempting to prove what it was that distinguished humans from non-humans. What is it that made humans unique? And Descartes, the great European white male who has forever patted all white European males on our backs and told us how wonderful we are because we think, therefore we are. And anyone else, you can fight for yourselves. Descartes was one of the people who drew this line in the sand, or as my dad liked to say, built a castle, and that castle was a castle that was exclusively for white males. And inside of that castle was the capacity for speech and language and various other skills that separated us from the rest of the animal kingdom. And so this project was looking at whether chimpanzees could actually learn a human language. And the notion was that in order to learn a human language, how is it that any of us learned the languages in which we were raised? We were born into a family of people we were born to love. We looked up at them at their faces, and we had these beautiful round faces ourselves that were all hardwired to love. And we wanted to communicate with each other. And of course, we were immersed in that language, in whatever our first language is. Might have been Russian, in my case it was English, others might have been in other languages. Well, in the case of attempting to teach a chimpanzee a human language, chimpanzees have no capacity for voluntary vocal speech. It's entirely limbically controlled. Limbically controlled, meaning if I were to drop this microphone on my foot, I wouldn't look down and say, that hurts, and then say, ow. I'd say, ow! It's a limbic response. Chimps are the same way. And that's highly adaptive if you are living in the wild. If you're living in the jungle and you're on the other side of the jungle and you see food, it is adaptive to have a food bark be involuntary, such that the rest of the community will know where you are and can come across the jungle and join you. In fact, Jane Goodall did some experiments where she would lure one chimp away from the tribe to a little spot of bananas, and the first time that the chimp saw the bananas, he would food bark, and the entire community would come and they'd get the bananas. And the second time, he got a little smarter, and he covered up his mouth, because he knew he was going to see the bananas, but he knew he couldn't control it. But with that being the premise, since you can't teach a chimp to speak English, well, actually, I should insert that there was a chimp in the 1950s who, in the hubris of humanity, they did try to teach English, vocal English. And since Vicky had no voluntary capacity for her vocal cords, she was able to come up with 4 words. Her chimp accent was, for mama, papa, cup, and up was, which was a non-larynx using version of speech. And so what the notion was, they saw that chimps had a high capacity for nonverbal communication, so why not immerse a chimp in a family that speaks only sign language, only friends, only people that she loves, in this case, and just sign around her. And lo, after a few weeks of the project, Washoe had acquired 500 signs. I, infelicitously, was a 2-year-old boy whose language was developing a lot slower than a chimpanzee's, and so although this is something that we find in humans as well, humans have a high capacity for nonverbal communication through the first 18 months. So when Washoe was 9 years old, my dad got his first professorship at the University of Oklahoma, and the entire family moved to Oklahoma, where Washoe joined a community of chimps. She'd never seen chimps before. She'd only been raised around humans. My dad asked her, what are the other chimps? And she said, well, they're black bugs. She knew that she was not one of them. She was our culture. She spoke our language, sign language. There are a couple different anecdotes that come out of that, and I'm just going to sort of, in the interest of time, move through them as efficiently as possible. So we moved to Oklahoma, and there's a young chimp named Bowie that my dad was working with, and Bowie ended up catching the sign language virus, because what happened was Washoe spoke sign language, and then the other chimps started to pick out up as well. And he was taking Bowie for a walk, and it was time to, and at this time where they were, the chimps had to have leads, which were largely ineffectual because chimps are 8 times the strength of a human pound for pound. So, for example, when Washoe when they were moving from Nevada to Oklahoma, they had to sedate her. And at 9 years old, prepubescent or pubescent Washoe, the plan was for each of her 4 closest male friends, which were 5'8" men, we're going to play with her, and each one would, on the cue, my dad's cue, take one arm and one leg. And my dad would come up with a syringe and inject her to sedate her and put her on a plane and fly her to Oklahoma. So he pulls, they're tickling her, each one on the cue grabs an arm, he pulls out the syringe, she sees the syringe, and throws all 4 men across the room. So that's a 9-year-old chimp. Bowie, who was another 9-year-old chimp, was his name, and my dad were walking, and Bowie was on the lead, and it was time to go in. And Bowie doesn't want to go in, so he goes up a tree. And my dad, being a young professor who had his graduate students around him at this point, wanted to demonstrate to them the power that he had as an alpha male. And he told Bowie, "You will come down now." And Bowie, who was sitting on a branch, reached down with one arm and picked the lead and lifted my dad off the ground. And so, in the theme of love, and in the theme of why it's important to incorporate love into business, my dad did what I think is a really smart thing. He embraced his humble side, and he forgave Bowie. He said, "I'm sorry, I forgive you." Bowie, delighted to be forgiven, jumps out of the tree, and they go home. And that's one of the things that I've taken with me into the business world, is remembering, and we've talked about it a lot over the past couple talks, which is, how do we leave our ego at the door? How do we incorporate humility and love into engaging our fellow human? Well, I argue that we should apply this not just to humans, but to everyone. Another interesting thing about chimps is that chimps, we've all heard how chimps are 99.9% human, or we're 99.9% chimp. The reality is we're more chimp than human, and chimps are more human than any of the other great apes. Chimps are not monkeys, they're not gorillas, they're not orangutans, they're not macaques, they're not any of the other great apes. They are pretty much us. We're each other. But from a visual perspective, sometimes a visual perspective is most helpful. Richard Dawkins, who an author many of you may know about, tells a story about the continuity of genetic relations. So if Samantha were standing here and Washoe was facing you, and Samantha took the hand of her mother, and Washoe took the hand of her mother, and each of you took the hands of your mothers, and you made a chain of mothers, and you went out the door, and we went out to the freeway, and we drove, and this chain of mothers went all the way to New York City. By the time those chains of mothers would have reached New York City, they would take the hand of the same person. So our difference is one of degree rather than kind. And that, again, ties into the rights of nature, which is we need to remember that we're all integrated, and we're all the same. As the indigenous people say at the Bioneers conference, we all share the same blood. And that gets back to Descartes. So Descartes, basically, as my dad argues, built a castle. And what we see with the Cartesian castle is the Cartesian drawbridge will be let down, and the first person to be let in the white male castle were African-American males. In fact, if you look at the history of the suppression of women, it dates back far beyond Descartes. It goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle had a rank order of intellect, and at the top of the chain was man, and the next down was like elephants, the next was whales, the next was woman, and the next was apes. So women have been pathologically suppressed by our culture and restrained. So rather than my dad argues, rather than letting the drawbridge down and letting one person in, we should blow up the castle. And so when I hear the conversations today about love, I think, how can we blow up that Cartesian castle and really open this all up for collaboration? So that's Descartes, and that's and so I'm going to skip forward just a little bit. So in 1979, very quickly, 1979 was a pretty powerful year. This is a picture of Washoe with her first son, Sequoia. She got pregnant. Sequoia, because he was living in a cage with Washoe, got a lung infection. And this is another interesting thing, is that Washoe took a toothbrush and tried to get rid of the phlegm, we assume. She didn't have signs to express that from him. Ended up lacerating his throat. They took him away, and he ended up dying. And so my dad came in and had to tell Washoe that the baby is finished. And every time he would come in and greet her, she would say, baby, 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 and finished, my dad would say, and then the arms would drop. And she went into a clinical depression, and she stopped eating. And my dad realized that he had to do something to try to, well, the other reason with this was that the criticism against the chimpanzee research at that point was, well, Washoe was just a really smart chimp, and all the other chimps, that doesn't really count. But can a chimp pass sign language on to its offspring? And the offspring died. So they went to get a new offspring, a new child, an adoptive child, and that was actually on my 12th birthday, a little boy named Lulis. And my dad drove 24 hours to Atlanta, Georgia, then back to Oklahoma. This was my 12th birthday. Lulis arrives, and then he takes Lulis to meet Washoe. And he tells Washoe that he has a baby, and Washoe gets very excited. She signs baby, 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 and gets super animated. And then he brings in a baby, and then the signs change. Oh, baby, it's a baby, it's not my baby. And but he puts Lulis in the cage with Washoe, and after something like 24 hours of the two wanting nothing to do with the other, because why would this infant want to be in the arms of this strange female? Washoe, in the middle of the night, screams, scares Lulis, and out of fright, he jumps into the arm of the nearest warm person, and that was Washoe, and they ended up together happily ever after. So of those couple points, we have humility, leaving your ego at the door, and taking a culture on its own terms. So what does a child who's been raised by some chimpanzee sign language researchers do for a career? Well, I like to say that instead of being interested in interspecies communication, I was interested in intraspecies communication. So naturally, I would go work for the State Department, which is what I did. But my passion there was to try to find ways to build bridges between cultures and to try to apply, as I found later, the lessons that I had learned by observing the community that I had been raised in, of the chimps. And there were a couple of interesting things that started to happen. One is, in 1979, in addition to sequoia dying, in addition to Washoe adopting a new child, this is my last anecdote here, we lost all federal funding for the research project. My dad did, and that meant that we had to go into volunteer mode. So my parents ended up creating a nonprofit to fundraise for the chimps, and that meant that we, as kids, ended up having to play the role as a graduate student. So at 13 years old, I was enlisted as a graduate research assistant, collecting data on what certain chimps were saying to each other. I and my sisters would go to grocery stores, which generously allowed us to take day-old food because humans won't eat brown bananas, but chimps sure will. And humans won't eat brown food that's a couple days old, but chimps will. And so we created this nonprofit, and the whole family was enlisted. I was donating my paycheck as a dishwasher at a local restaurant. And what I learned in that, and the lesson that has carried with me through to my current role, is the importance of ethics. At the same time as well, when my dad decided to create a nonprofit for the welfare of the chimps in 1980, he was highly criticized by the scientific community. And he was criticized because the scientific community says that if you're going to do sound research, you cannot like that which you're researching, and particularly when it comes to researching other living beings. You have to maintain a level of dispassion. And his argument was, why would any of those studies be valid if you don't love the community and the people with whom you're working? For instance, we would never, in the human space, consider data researching incarcerated humans relevant to non-incarcerated humans. Why? Because we know that incarcerated humans, there is a positive causal correlation between psychological well-being and incarceration, meaning you're much more likely to be psychologically ill and thus physically ill if you're incarcerated, and thus the data doesn't necessarily apply in terms of being able to answer questions about how things are. And so the notion that we have that we're all related, that we have to love the work that we're doing, and particularly love the people with whom we're working, ended up being a relevant theme. And that led me in sort of a destiny-long journey. I left the State Department. I ended up, as you heard, launching a couple think tanks. And then 20 months ago, I joined Bioneers. Bioneers, which is very much a part of this family, very much part of John and Dan and Samantha. And I look at us as not only are we as humans all related, but our organizations are all related. There's a fabric of love that connects us. And I'm going to stop there in the interest of time, but I would just like to offer, just with putting on my Bioneers hat, and I was talking to Samantha about this, is when I joined Bioneers 20 months ago, and I interviewed people about what was it about Bioneers that people felt we needed or was most special, and people said, we are at a time where we've gone from, as Kenny Alsabel, the founder of Bioneers, says, from urgency to emergency. It's not enough to have one event per year. We need to have many events. And so I was talking to Samantha about the fact that we should look at the Love Summit and Bioneers as twin stars, that we could start to build a cosmology around, in which each node around the year could be serving these very practical approaches to solutions-based approaches to healing our people and planet. And so I've created a special discount for everyone here. Bioneers tickets are on sale now, and they're currently at 50% off. But if you register in the next 10 days, you'll get, and you enter the word love on checkout, you'll get another $50 off. So it's the steepest, cheapest you'll ever get into the Bioneers Summit. Anyway, in the interest of time, I'm going to thank you all for your attention, and I love you.